He took in 12 war widows for the winter. Now none of them want to leave. The howl of the wind was a living thing. It was a predator that had hunted this world for millennia, and Dominic had long ago learned to respect it. On Boreas Prime, winter was not a season. It was a siege. He tightened the final bolt on the exterior storm shutter, the durasteel groaning under the strain of the first assault. Inside the workshop, the air was warm, smelling of hot metal and lubricating oil. The low, steady thrum of the geothermal generator was the homestead's heartbeat, a constant reassurance against the planet's fury. He trusted his work. The walls were shielded, the foundations sunk 30 meters into the bedrock, and the heat core could run for a decade without maintenance. He had built his solitude to last. A discordant screech cut through the storm's deep baritone. It was the sound of tortured metal, a sound he knew from another life, a lifetime ago, a sound of falling. He moved to the central command console, his boots echoing on the grated floor. The long-range sensors were a blizzard of white noise, but a short-range proximity alert was screaming, painting a desperate red smear across the topographical map of the northern ridge, less than 3 kilometers away. A ship. No one in their right mind flew in this weather, which meant they were not in their right mind. They were desperate. "Damn it," he muttered to the empty room. The code was buried deep, but it was not dead. You do not leave people to die in the cold. He strode to the vehicle bay, the heavy insulated doors hissing open to reveal the squat, powerful form of his crawler. It was a brutish, utilitarian machine he'd built himself from the bones of a mining hauler, with oversized treads and a forward-mounted thermal lance for clearing ice falls. He pulled on the outer layers of his exposure suit, the seals hissing shut as the helmet locked into place. Solitude was a choice, negligence was a sin. The crawler punched through the bay doors into a world of pure, violent white. Visibility was less than a meter. He drove by instrument, the machine's powerful lamps carving a fleeting tunnel through the swirling snow. The wind rocked the 10-ton vehicle, and the cold was so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against the hull. He found the wreckage by its heat signature. A small shuttle, sleek and alien in design, had plowed a long, black scar in the snow before crumpling against a rock outcropping. Its hull was breached, and the faint light inside flickered and died. He cut the engine and disembarked, the wind tearing at him instantly. Magnetic clamps on his boots kept him anchored to the frozen ground. Using the thermal lance on a low setting, he cut a wider opening in the buckled fuselage and stepped inside. The air was frigid, thick with the smell of burned wiring and something else, something musky and panicked. Emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows. And then he saw them. Figures, huddled together in the back, wrapped in thin, metallic fabric, 12 of them. They were humanoid, but taller, more slender than a human, and they had ears, like a fox or a wolf, that sat high on their heads, twitching, tracking his every move. One of them rose, placing herself between him and the others. She was wrapped in the same silver blanket, but she held a shard of jagged metal like a dagger. Her hair was the color of a dying fire, a fierce auburn that was the only spot of warmth in the entire scene. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated, but they burned with defiance. Her vulpine ears were laid back flat against her skull, a clear signal of aggression. "Stay back," she hissed, the words translated by his helmet's implant into clipped, formal galactic standard. Dominic raised his hands slowly, palms open. He didn't speak. Words were useless here. He was a monster in a bulky suit, an unknown in their moment of terror. His actions were all that mattered. He slowly unsealed his helmet, pulling it off. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath. He let them see his face, the lines of concern etched around his eyes, the condensation of his breath pluming in the air. He looked past the defiant leader at the others. They were shivering, their lips tinged with blue. One of them, with pale blue hair, had tears freezing on her cheeks. They had minutes, not hours. He looked back at the redhead. Her gaze was unwavering. He gave a single, slow nod toward the howling chaos outside, then pointed back at himself, and then made a walking motion with his fingers toward the floor. "I can lead you out of here." He didn't wait for her to agree. He turned his back on her weapon, a gesture of absolute trust or absolute foolishness, and began clearing a stable path out of the wreck. He heard a sharp intake of breath behind him, a flurry of softly chittered words, and then the crunch of footsteps in the snow-dusted interior. She was following. The others would follow her. He redonned his helmet, the warmth a welcome relief, and led them out into the heart of the storm. Closing the main door to the homestead was like ending a war. The shriek of the wind was cut off instantly, replaced by the deep, resonant hum of the generator. The sudden silence was as shocking as the preceding violence. The 12 Kythons stood huddled on the decontamination grate just inside the airlock, blinking in the steady, warm light. They looked like a gathering of exotic, broken birds, their vibrant hair, auburn, black, silver, magenta, a chaotic splash of color against the drab gray of the Durasteel walls. They shed their thin emergency blankets, revealing practical but lightweight tunics and leggings, utterly inadequate for the world outside. Jylen, the auburn-haired leader, kept her position at their head. The shard of metal was gone, but her posture was just as sharp. Her dark, intelligent eyes swept over the cavernous main room, taking in the workshop, the integrated hydroponics bay behind a wall of reinforced glass, the stone hearth where a low fire crackled, and the spiral staircase leading to the living quarters above. It was a place of stark functionality, of stone and steel, but it was undeniably safe. It was warm. Dominic cycled the outer airlock and began shrugging out of his exposure suit, hanging it on its designated rack, where heating elements immediately began to sublimate the ice. He watched them in the polished reflection of a tool locker. They were afraid, but beneath the fear was a hard, brittle pride. He saw how they clustered, how the others deferred to Jylen with the slightest dip of their heads. He understood hierarchies. "You are safe here," he said, his voice sounding rough in the quiet. The translator in his ear rendered their silent appraisal back to him as a low murmur of anxious Kython dialect. "For what price?" Jylen's voice was clear and cold. Dominic turned fully, leaning back against a heavy workbench. He met her gaze. "The price is that you don't freeze to death. That's the only transaction on the table." Another woman, this one with hair as black as polished obsidian and a warrior's stern face, stepped beside Jylen. "Our culture does not accept charity. Debts must be named." "Fine," Dominic said, his patience already wearing thin. He was a man who preferred the simple logic of machines to the convoluted reasoning of strangers. "You have a debt of survival. You can repay it by not dying and not breaking my equipment. Can you manage that?" His bluntness seemed to startle them. Jylen's ears flickered, the only sign of her surprise. She exchanged a look with the dark-haired woman. He sighed, the sound loud in the hall. "Look, my name is Dominic. This is my home. Your ship is a total loss, and even if it wasn't, no one can fly in this storm. The winter on Boreas lasts for 3 standard months. Until the thaw, you are grounded. So am I. We are stuck here together." He gestured to the fully stocked kitchenette integrated into one wall. "There is food. There are sleeping quarters upstairs. There's a medical station if you are injured." He paused, letting the reality of his words sink in. This is not a prison. But the world outside that door is a death sentence. The rules are simple. Help with the chores, conserve resources, and stay inside. That's all I ask. He watched Jylen process this. She was their leader, and the weight of their lives was a visible burden on her slender frame. Her people were newly widowed, a fact his scanner had picked up from their frantic, grief-stricken comm chatter before the crash. Their husbands, their entire fleet, annihilated in a war on the other side of the sector. Now they were here, at the mercy of a single, strange male of a species known for its brutish physicality. "We accept your terms," Jylen said finally, her voice tight with a pride that had been pushed to its absolute limit. "Under protest." Dominic almost smiled. "Protest noted," he said, turning to the kitchenette. "Now, who wants something hot to drink?" The offer of simple comfort seemed to disarm them more than any threat could have. The younger one, the girl with pale blue hair, looked at Jylen with wide, pleading eyes. Jylen gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. It was a surrender, not to him, but to the basic, undeniable need for warmth and sustenance. He busied himself with the water heater and ration packs, letting them have the moment. He could feel 12 pairs of eyes on his back, watching his every move, analyzing, judging. The siege outside was over for the day, the one inside had just begun. The alarm was a high, piercing shriek that sliced through the quiet hum of the homestead 3 days later. It was not a perimeter breach or a fire suppression warning, it was a life support alert. A pressure icon flashed red on the main console. Dominic was up from his workbench before the second chime, his eyes scanning the diagnostics. Atmospheric recycler, pump 3. Pressure dropping. Critical. He saw the Kython emerge from the upstairs quarters, their faces etched with alarm. They clutched at each other, their movements bird-like and panicked. "What is happening?" a magenta-haired woman asked, her voice trembling. "A bearing in the recycler pump seized," Dominic said, already moving toward the maintenance corridor, grabbing a heavy toolkit from the wall. "We're losing air pressure. The backups have kicked in, but they'll only hold for a few hours." Jylan was there, blocking his path. "Should we not get to the escape pods?" Dominic stopped and looked at her as if she'd sprouted a second head. "This station doesn't have escape pods. It has a workshop. I don't run from problems. I fix them." He pushed past her and threw open the heavy door to the pump room. A blast of cold, stale air washed over them. The room was a tangle of pipes and conduits, all converging on 3 massive, cylindrical pumps that formed the heart of the station's atmosphere and heating systems. The third one was shuddering violently, a high-pitched metallic scream coming from its core. Jylan and a few of the others followed him to the doorway, hesitating on the threshold. "Stay back," Dominic commanded. "If the casing breaches, it'll vent coolant everywhere." He stripped off his heavy overshirt, leaving him in a dark gray t-shirt that did little to hide the powerful muscles of his arms and shoulders. A network of old, faded scars crisscrossed his skin. He took a deep breath and plunged into the cramped space behind the malfunctioning pump. Jylan watched, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She saw him brace his feet against a conduit and put his shoulder into a massive wrench, straining to loosen a meter-wide access plate. The muscles in his back corded, sweat already beading on his temples from the exertion. This was not the clean, precise work of droids and particle beams she was used to. This was crude, loud, and brutally physical. It was terrifying, and it was utterly captivating. "The retaining bolt is torqued too tight," he grunted, his voice echoing in the confined space. "I can't get enough leverage from this angle." He tried again, a low curse rumbling in his chest as the wrench slipped. He backed out of the space, wiping grease and sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. His eyes found Jylan in the doorway. "You," he said, his voice flat and devoid of pleasantry. "Your hands are smaller than mine." "I need you to get in there and guide the bit." She recoiled. "I am not a mechanic." "You are today," he shot back, his gaze hard. "We have about an hour of air before the backups start to fail. Do you want to stand there on ceremony, or do you want to breathe?" The black-haired skeptic beside her tensed, but Jylan held up a hand. He was right. Honor was a luxury they could not afford. With a tight nod, she stepped into the pump room. The noise was deafening, the vibrations rattling her bones. "Tell me what to do," she said, her voice barely audible over the mechanical scream. He handed her a heavy magnetic driver. "There's a release valve under the primary housing. I need you to brace this against it while I reverse the pressure from the control panel. Don't let it slip." He showed her where to place her hands, his fingers briefly brushing against hers. His touch was rough, calloused, but there was a strange current in it, a spark of energy that made her flinch. She squeezed into the tight space. The heat from the struggling machine was intense. She could feel its death throes through the deck plates. "I am in position," she called out. "Hold tight," he yelled back. He worked the panel, and the shuddering of the pump intensified. The driver in her hands bucked, trying to tear itself from her grip. She held on, her muscles straining, her teeth gritting. She felt Dominic's hand on her back, steadying her, his solid presence a rock in the chaos. Together they held the line. With a final deafening groan, the pump seized completely and then fell silent. The emergency alarms stopped. The only sound was their own ragged breathing in the sudden echoing quiet. He helped her out of the cramped space, his hand lingering on her arm for a moment longer than necessary. Her face was smudged with grease, her eyes wide. "The main bearing is shot," he said, his voice low. "But I can bypass it. We'll have heat and air." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time his expression held something other than pragmatic detachment. It was respect. "You did good." Jylin just nodded, unable to find her voice. She was a high-born matriarch, a widow of a great warrior, and she had just discovered a profound and unsettling satisfaction in the simple, tangible weight of iron in her hands. A routine born of necessity began to settle over the homestead. The days were marked not by the passage of the sun, which remained a pale, distant smear behind the perpetual storm clouds, but by the cycles of the station's systems. Mornings were for maintenance checks and hydroponics. Afternoons were for repairs, study, or training. The vast emptiness of the winter was filled with the small, essential acts of survival. Dominic, to Zylin's surprise, was a patient teacher. He showed the magenta-haired technician how to read the geothermal core's energy outputs, and she, in turn, began to see the elegant logic behind his seemingly crude systems. He taught the skeptic how to strip and clean the projectile rifle, and her grim face showed a flicker of approval at the weapon's simple, reliable design. He even found a task for the timid, blue-haired youth, showing her how to pollinate the high-yield, protein-rich crops in the hydroponics bay, a delicate task that suited her gentle nature. The transition was not without difficulty. One afternoon, while recalibrating a pressure seal, one of the younger widows cross-threaded the fitting, causing a minor but noisy steam leak. She flinched back with a cry of frustration, tears welling in her eyes. "I cannot do this. This is not our way," she sobbed. Before Dominic could intervene, the silver-haired elder was at the younger one's side, her hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Our old way is ash, little one," the elder said, her voice soft but firm. "Our new way is learning. We will all make mistakes. Now let us try again together." The moment of shared struggle and mutual support did more to solidify their resolve than any success could have. Dominic did not coddle them. He expected them to learn, to contribute, to pull their own weight. But he never raised his voice, never showed frustration. He simply demonstrated a task, corrected mistakes with a quiet word or a guiding hand, and then trusted them to do the work. It was a form of respect they had never known. In Kythan society, females were protected, sheltered, and commanded. They were not trusted with the fundamental mechanics of their own survival. Jylin found her role as their leader transformed. Dominic had tasked her with creating the work rosters and managing their resources, a tacit acknowledgement of her authority. She organized her sisters, her commands no longer born of fear but of purpose. The emotional walls between them and their host were also thawing. Laughter, a sound Jylin had thought she might never hear again, began to echo in the halls. Late one night, she sat with Dominic at the main console, going over the station's power consumption logs. The only lights were the soft glow of the monitors and the distant flicker of the fire in the hearth. "You were a soldier," she stated, not a question. He didn't look up from the screen. "A long time ago. The Grathul, the ones who—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The war that had made them widows. "I fought them," he said, his voice flat, "on a different front, for a different reason." He finally turned to look at her. The console's light carved sharp shadows on his rugged face. "They're butchers, and they don't give up." A cold dread trickled down her spine, a premonition that chilled her more than the ever-present cold outside. In this quiet moment, with the storm a distant murmur and the warmth of the station wrapped around them, she felt a bond forming that went deeper than mere survival. It was a fragile, terrifying thing. She saw the way his eyes lingered on her, the way he seemed to be fighting something within himself. And she recognized it, because she was fighting it too. The station had become a sanctuary, but the man who had built it was becoming something else entirely. He was becoming the anchor in their storm-tossed existence, and the thought of one day having to leave was a new and sharper kind of grief. The lull in the storm came without warning. For the first time in weeks, the wind did not scream. The sudden quiet was unnerving, a held breath in the heart of winter. It was the youth who saw it first, her face pressed against the thick, insulated glass of the main viewport. "There's a light," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and terror. They all gathered, Dominic included. A single, sharp point of energy was descending through the gray, roiling clouds. It grew steadily, resolving into the blocky, aggressive silhouette of a Grathul Empire gunship. It was gunmetal gray, scarred from recent battles, its insignia, a clenched, armored fist, stark against the hull. The blood drained from the Keithans' faces. The skeptic instinctively moved for the rifle rack. Xylan's hand went to the small blade she now kept tucked in her belt. "Nobody panic," Dominic said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through their fear. "Let's hear them out." The ship landed half a kilometer away, its engines melting a perfect circle in the deep snow. A single shuttle detached and made its way toward the homestead. Dominic watched it on the external cameras, his face a grim mask. "They're hailing us," the technician reported from the comm station, her magenta hair seeming to pale in the harsh light. "They claim it's a humanitarian mission. They tracked our shuttle's distress beacon." "Let them land," Dominic said. "Open the outer airlock, but keep the inner one sealed. I'll meet them there." Xylan stepped forward. "I will go with you." "No," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You and the others stay here. Lock down this room. If things go wrong, you seal the corridor and you don't open it for anything. Understood?" She met his hard gaze and, for the first time, did not argue. She simply nodded. Dominic met the Grathul delegation in the sterile, gray airlock. There were 3 of them, clad in black, bulky armor. Their leader was massive, even for a Grathul, his face a landscape of ritual scars. He removed his helmet, revealing a cruel, arrogant sneer. "I am Sub-Commander Vorlag," the Grathul growled, his voice like grinding rocks. "We are here to offer assistance to the survivors of the Kythan vessel." "The survivors are fine," Dominic said, his arms crossed over his chest. "We don't need any assistance." Vorlag laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Our intelligence on you Solitude-class colonists is quite thorough. Paranoid hermits, hoarding scrap. A single human is not a threat. You are a curiosity." He took a step forward, looming over Dominic. "I am here for the Kythan widows. My orders are to secure them and a valuable asset they were transporting. Hand them over, and I will let you live out your pathetic existence in this icebox." "They are under my protection," Dominic stated calmly. "They're not going anywhere." Vorlag's sneer deepened. "Protection? Do you even know who you are harboring, human? They are the mates of traitors. Their shuttle carried a rebel database, and my orders are to retrieve it intact. The widows will also be taken alive. They have knowledge of the resistance that must be extracted." He let the final word hang in the air, heavy with threat. His gaze flicked toward the inner door, especially the one with the red hair. "I imagine she knows a great deal." Something shifted in Dominic's stance. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible change, but the air in the airlock crackled with sudden menace. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't move a muscle, but when he spoke, his words were as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "You will not touch them." The threat was so blatant, so utterly devoid of fear, that Vorlag actually took a half step back. He looked at the human before him, this lone, unarmored man standing against the might of the Empire, and saw not a hermit, but something else, something far more dangerous. "You have just made a fatal mistake, human," Vorlag snarled, reaching for the sidearm holstered on his thigh. Before his fingers could touch the grip, Dominic moved. It was a blur of motion, economical and brutally efficient. He slammed the emergency cycle button for the outer door. As alarms blared and the massive door began to hiss shut, he grabbed the sub-commander's arm, spun him around, and shoved him and his soldiers back toward their shuttle. "Get off my property," Dominic said, his voice low and lethal just before the door sealed, leaving him alone once more in the echoing silence of the airlock. The siege had begun. Dominic returned to the main hall. The Keithan were gathered by the inner door, their faces pale, their ears pinned back in fear and apprehension. Xylan stood at their front, her hands still resting on the hilt of her knife. "What happened?" she demanded. "The good news is they're not here to rescue you," Dominic said, his voice grim. "The bad news is they're here to kill you and take a database I'm assuming is hidden on your shuttle." The technician gasped. The archive of the Resistance. How could they know? "They're Grathul. It's what they do," Dominic said, moving to the central command console. His fingers flew across the keypad, his motions precise and sure. "They won't risk a direct assault in this weather against a fortified target. Not until they know what they're up against. They'll establish a perimeter and wait for the storm to break. He looked up at them, his eyes sweeping over their terrified faces. Which gives us time to prepare. With a final keystroke, he initiated a new command protocol. A deep, resonant clang echoed through the homestead as heavy steel plates slid down over the main viewport, plunging the room into the soft, artificial light of the station. More sounds followed. The hum of powerful capacitors charging, the whine of targeting servos, the solid thud of magnetic locks engaging. The skeptic stared, her mouth slightly agape. "What is this place?" "I was a combat engineer," Dominic said simply, as if that explained everything. "Forward-based design and fortification was my specialty. I built this place to withstand a siege. I just never expected to have to use it." On the main screen, a schematic of the homestead appeared, now overlaid with a web of defensive grids. Automated turret emplacements, previously hidden beneath the snow, were now active. Seismic sensors lit up the perimeter, and the geothermal core began shunting a fraction of its power to a shield emitter he'd salvaged from a derelict military transport years ago. The homestead was no longer a home. It was a fortress. A new energy surged through the Kython, chasing away the paralysis of fear. It was the faintest glimmer of hope. Jylin stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a fire Dominic had not seen before. "The database is in a shielded compartment beneath the shuttle's cockpit. We must retrieve it. It contains tactical information that could cripple Vorlag's command structure." "They'll have the wreck guarded," Dominic countered. "The storm is getting worse," Jylin argued, pointing to the meteorological display. "Their visibility will be 0. My sisters are faster and quieter in the snow than any Grathul soldier. The skeptic and I can get to the shuttle undetected." Dominic studied her, then the readouts. It was a massive risk, but she was right. It was a risk with a chance of success. "All right," he conceded, "but you take comms and you take these." He pulled 2 slim dark gray pistols from a weapons locker. "They're kinetic pulse pistols, no energy signature to detect. Point, shoot, don't miss." As Jylin and the skeptic prepared, donning the thermal gear he provided, the other Kython rallied. The technician began working with Dominic, helping him fine-tune the defense grid, her quick mind easily grasping the complex systems. The elder started organizing their rations, her calm demeanor a soothing presence in the rising tension. Even the youth found a job, monitoring the short-range sensors, her sharp eyes tasked with spotting any movement in the snow. Just before she sealed her helmet, Jylin paused in front of Dominic. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. The thin veneer of host and refugee had been stripped away. They were commander and lieutenant, partners in a desperate war. He reached out and adjusted the fit of her collar, his gloved fingers brushing against her neck. "Be careful," he said, his voice a low command. "We are Kython," she replied, a flash of their old fierce pride in her eyes. "We are always careful." He watched her and the skeptic disappear into the swirling white of the airlock, 2 ghosts swallowed by the storm. He turned back to the console, his home, his sanctuary, now a battlefield. And he was no longer defending just his solitude, he was defending 13 lives. The blizzard was a physical entity, a maelstrom of ice and fury that clawed at the homestead's walls. For 2 hours, the only sign of the Grathul was the occasional flicker of a heat signature on the perimeter sensors as Vorlag's soldiers established their positions. Inside, the tension was a coiled spring. Every groan of the structure, every flurry of static over the comms, made them flinch. Dominic stood before the main tactical display, a still point in the storm of activity, orchestrating their defense. "Jylin, report," he said into his throat mic, his voice calm. "We are in position," her voice came back, strained but clear, laced with the hiss of the wind. "The wreck is 50 meters ahead. 2 guards, standard armor, they're hunkered down behind an engine block, trying to stay out of the wind." "The wind is your friend," Dominic reminded her. "Use it." He watched 2 friendly icons on the map separate, moving in a wide pincer formation. The Kython were born of a world with dense forests and low light. They moved with a silent, predatory grace that no human or hulking Grathul could match. Their enhanced hearing allowed them to pinpoint the soldiers through the disorienting roar of the storm. The enemy icons on the map vanished without a single alarm being raised. "Guards are down," Jylen reported, her breathing slightly heavier. "We're inside." Minutes stretched into an eternity. The youth suddenly cried out, pointing to the sensor display. "Movement, a lot of it, from the west." "They know," Dominic swore. "Vorlag sent his main force. He's testing our defenses." He switched comm channels. "Xylan, time's up. Get the database and get out of there now. Full assault incoming." "We have it," she replied. "We're on our way back." The first wave of Grathul soldiers emerged from the whiteout, their armored forms like lumbering beasts. As they advanced, Dominic coordinated the defense, his voice a steady presence in the Kythan's ears. In the midst of the chaos, as targeting solutions flashed across the main screen, his eyes met Jylen's on a secondary monitor showing the command center. For a heartbeat, the battle faded. There was only a shared look, a silent acknowledgement of the precipice on which they stood, a flicker of fear mirrored and understood, and an absolute, unspoken trust that was more binding than any vow. Then the moment broke, and they were back in the war. He activated the homestead's external speakers, blasting a low-frequency seismic pulse directly toward a northern ravine. Then he targeted the automated turrets, not on the soldiers, but on the snowpack just above them. The heavy, wet snow, disturbed by the sonic vibrations and the turret impacts, began to shift. The Grathul, realizing the danger, began to fall back, but it was too late. With a deafening crack, an avalanche swept half of Vorlag's force away. The remaining soldiers, scattered and disoriented, fell back toward the ravine for cover. A fatal mistake. New heat signatures, massive and serpentine, erupted from the snow, and the screams of the Grathul were a brief, satisfying chorus of terror. Just then, Jylen and the skeptic tumbled back through the airlock, clutching a heavily shielded databank. The skeptic had a shallow plasma burn along one arm, but they were alive. They had the prize. "Report," Jylen said, pulling off her helmet, her face flushed with adrenaline and cold. "First wave repelled," Dominic said, a grim smile touching his lips. "It seems the local wildlife doesn't appreciate uninvited guests." He looked at the tactical map. Vorlag had lost a third of his troops without them firing a single direct shot. They had won the first battle, but the Grathul gunship still sat on the horizon, a brooding promise of the war to come. This victory had been bought with ingenuity and luck, and they were running low on both. The victory was short-lived. Vorlag, enraged and humiliated, changed tactics. He ceased the ground assaults and began a systematic, relentless bombardment. Heavy plasma bolts, fired from the gunship's main cannon, slammed into the homestead's shield. Each impact was a deafening concussion that shook the structure to its foundations, making the lights flicker and the deck plates vibrate. It was a battle of attrition. "He's not aiming for the habitat," the technician observed, her eyes glued to the energy diffusion display. "The impacts are all focused around the shield emitter. He's trying to surgically disable us, not annihilate us. He still wants what's in here." They were trapped. The constant, bone-jarring impacts wore on their nerves. They retreated to the lower levels, closer to the bedrock. The geothermal core room became their sanctuary. The room was warm, filled with the steady, reassuring hum of the massive drill and turbine assembly that drew heat from the planet's core. For hours, they worked, Jylen and the technician frantically decrypting the database while Dominic diverted power, rerouted damaged circuits, and tried to reinforce the shield. Late into the cycle, as the bombardment paused, an exhausted silence fell over the core room. The other widows had found places to rest, curled up on supply crates and thermal blankets. Only Dominic and Jylen remained awake, sitting near the glowing heart of the reactor. The shield was holding at 17%. "My husband was an architect," Jylen said, her voice barely a whisper. "He designed cities that floated in the clouds. He believed beauty was the purest form of strength. The Grathul destroyed it all in a single hour." She looked at her hands, smudged with carbon scoring. "He would not recognize what I have become." "He would be proud," Dominic said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are not just surviving, Xylen. You are fighting. You are leading. You are giving them a reason to live past their grief." She looked up, her gaze locking with his. The air between them, already charged by the silent acknowledgement during the battle, was now electric, stripped of all pretense by the raw proximity of death. The universe had shrunk to this single warm room. He saw the sorrow in her eyes, the exhaustion, and something else, a deep, aching hunger that mirrored his own. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing away a smudge of grease from her cheek. Her skin was soft, warm, her vulpine ears, which had been tense and alert for days, relaxed, drooping slightly. It was a sign of trust so profound it made his chest ache. She leaned into his touch, a small, involuntary movement. That was all it took. The walls they had so carefully constructed around themselves crumbled to dust. He closed the distance between them, his mouth finding hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, hungry collision, a raw expression of everything they could not say. It was the fury of the battle, the grief of their pasts, the terrifying, brilliant hope of a future they might not live to see. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer, while hers tangled in his hair, drawing him in. It was an affirmation, a fierce, silent declaration that even here, at the end of all things, they were alive. In the warm, humming heart of the storm, surrounded by the threat of imminent death, they chose life, together. They broke apart as the station shuddered from another impact, the moment of peace shattered. But something fundamental had shifted. The desperation was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They were no longer just allies, they were partners, and they were done waiting for the end to come to them. "I have it." The technician's voice was a triumphant cry from across the room. She pointed to a schematic on her datapad, a section of the Grathul gunship's underbelly highlighted in red. "It's a maintenance port for the primary shield projector. According to the resistance files, the armor is weakest there. A targeted charge precisely placed could cause a feedback loop and cripple the entire ship." "A charge we don't have," the skeptic pointed out, her tone flat. "We will," Dominic said, a dangerous light in his eyes. He was already moving toward the workshop. "The Kython shuttle's power core is still intact. It doesn't use standard fusion. It's a contained gravitational singularity. If I can destabilize the containment field, it won't explode. It will create a focused, directional implosion. It'll punch a hole through that hull and everything else within 2 meters. A perfect shaped charge." A plan, audacious and seemingly unthinkable, was born in the deep, warm heart of the fortress. It was a plan built on absolute trust. "Vorlag has gotten lazy," Xylan observed, studying the tactical map. "His ground troops are consolidating in a single position to the east, using the wreck of our shuttle for cover. He believes he has us pinned down." "Then we'll use that to our advantage," Dominic said, looking up from the volatile fuel cell he was carefully dismantling. "I'll create a diversion, a big one. I'll draw his troops west, into the open. That will be your window." He looked at Xylan. "You and the skeptic will take the charge. The storm is our only cover. You'll have to get within 20 meters of the gunship to place it accurately." It was a suicide mission. They all knew it. But it was the only mission they had left. An hour later, everything was in place. Dominic, clad once more in his heavy exposure suit and armed with the pulse rifle and a belt of concussion grenades, stood in the west airlock. Xylan and the skeptic, carrying the bulky, menacing shape of the improvised explosive, waited in the east. They were connected by a private comm channel. "Ready?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "Born ready," she replied, her own voice betraying none of the fear that was a cold knot in her stomach. "Be safe, Dominic." "You too," was all he said. He burst from the airlock, a solitary figure against the white rage of the blizzard. He didn't run. He opened fire on the Grathul positions, the pulse rifle firing silent, invisible bolts of kinetic energy that sent chunks of snow and ice flying. He was a perfect target, drawing their immediate furious attention. As the Grathul forces turned to engage him, Xylan and the skeptic slipped out of the opposite airlock, ghosts in the storm. Dominic's fight was a brutal ballet of violence and survival. He used every piece of cover, every trick he'd ever learned, leading the Grathul on a deadly chase across the frozen landscape. He was outnumbered 20-1, but he was on his home turf. Meanwhile, Xylan and the skeptic crawled on their bellies through the snow, the wind scouring them, the static cold seeping into their bones. The gunship loomed ahead, a mountain of dark metal. They reached the target, the maintenance port exactly where the schematic said it would be. Working with numb fingers, the skeptic armed the charge and magnetically clamped it to the hull. "The charge is set," Xylan whispered into the comm. "Timer is at 2 minutes. Get out of there." She heard the crackle of pulse fire, a grunt of pain from Dominic. "Go," he yelled back. "Get to cover!" They scrambled back as the seconds ticked down. Dominic, pinned down behind a rock outcropping, saw them reach the relative safety of a deep snowdrift. He laid down a final volley of suppressing fire, then turned and ran, a desperate, lung-burning sprint back toward the homestead. The charge detonated not with a loud bang, but with a deep, resonant thump that seemed to suck the air from the world. A brilliant violet light erupted from the gunship's belly as reality warped for a microsecond. Its shield flickered violently, then collapsed in a shower of sparks. Secondary explosions rocked the vessel, and it began to list, thick black smoke pouring from its wounds. The siege was broken. Vorlag was crippled. The silence that followed the gunship's death was more profound than any noise. The storm, as if its purpose was fulfilled, began to recede. For the first time in months, the wind did not howl. In the aftermath, they took stock. Dominic had a plasma burn across his ribs, deep but clean. The skeptic had minor frostbite on her fingertips. They were battered, exhausted, but they were alive, all 13 of them. Over the next few days, a strange peace settled. The sky cleared, revealing a pale, watery sun that cast long blue shadows across the snow. The Grathul were gone. Vorlag, in his crippled but still space-worthy vessel, had limped away into orbit, too proud or too wounded to finish the fight. They were truly alone now. Working together, they salvaged what they could from the battlefield. The Grathul technology was advanced, their weapons powerful. The technician was in paradise, her mind alight with possibilities. They repaired the gunship's long-range comms array, linking it to the homestead's power core. They could talk to the galaxy again. The message came a week later. It was from a neutral trade consortium, forwarded by the Kython resistance, who had received the database Xylan had transmitted. It was an official offer of asylum. A ship could be dispatched to take the 12 Kython war widows to a sanctuary colony in the Outer Rim, a place where they could live out their days in peace and safety. It was the escape they had dreamed of in their darkest moments. It was their way out. Xylan called a council. She, the elder, the skeptic, and the 9 others gathered in the main hall. Dominic was pointedly not invited. He stayed in his workshop, sharpening tools that didn't need sharpening, giving them the space to make their choice. He had offered them shelter for the winter. The winter was ending. Their agreement was fulfilled. A cold, hollow feeling settled in his chest, an ache that had nothing to do with his wound. An hour later, Xylan found him by the great viewport. The steel shutters were open again, and the view of the snow-covered valley under the pale sunlight was breathtaking. He didn't turn as she approached. "The transport will be here in 3 rotations," he said, his voice flat. He was staring out at the mountains. "It's a good colony. Safe, you'll be provided for." "We held a vote," she said, her voice soft. She came to stand beside him, their shoulders almost touching. He nodded, his jaw tight. "I'm sure it was a difficult decision." "It was not," she said. He finally turned to look at her. Her eyes were clear and bright, and for the first time since he'd met her, they held no trace of fear or grief. They held only a fierce, brilliant certainty. "The vote was unanimous. We are not leaving." Dominic stared at her, his mind struggling to process her words. "What are you talking about? This is your chance to be safe, to have a real life again." "We have a real life here," she insisted, stamping her foot lightly on the Durasteel floor. "When we crashed on this world, we were widows. That is what our culture called us. It is a name that means we are finished, that our story is over. We were waiting to die." She stepped closer, her gaze intense. "You never called us that. You called us mechanics, strategists, farmers, soldiers. You taught us that we are not defined by who we lost, but by what we can build." She gestured to the room around them, to the patched walls and the gleaming hydroponics bay and the weapons rack that now held both human and Grathul technology. "We are not the women who fell from the sky. We are the women who survived the winter. We are not refugees who need a sanctuary. We are homesteaders, and this is our home." He looked past her at the other 11 Kython who had gathered at the base of the stairs. The skeptic gave him a sharp, respectful nod. The elder smiled, a slow, knowing expression. The youth waved, a bright, genuine smile on her face. They were not broken. They were strong. They were founders. "There is a war to fight," Xylan continued, her voice ringing with purpose. "With the database, with the technology we now have, we can help the resistance. We can build a base here, a home. We can build a future." She reached out, her hand resting on his arm. Her touch was warm, firm. "We want to build it with you, Dominic." He looked at her, at this incredible woman who had walked out of a storm and into his heart, and then at the family he had never known he wanted. The cold, hollow ache in his chest was gone, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the geothermal generator. The solitude he had built so carefully had been shattered, and in its place was something infinitely better. He smiled, a true broad smile that transformed his rugged features. "All right," he said, "let's get to work." 5 years after the first thaw, the landscape of the northern valley on Boreas Prime was irrevocably changed. The original homestead, the stone and steel heart of their world, was now the central keep of a sprawling, thriving settlement. New structures, built with a unique fusion of rugged human engineering and elegant Kython design, fanned out from its base. A vast, multi-domed hydroponics facility glowed with the green light of a dozen different biomes. A state-of-the-art communications tower, constructed from the salvaged spine of the Grathul gunship, rose like a silver needle into the pale sky, its dish constantly turned toward the stars, listening and speaking. In a deep ravine, sheltered from the worst of the winds, a small shipyard buzzed with the work of plasma welders and gravlifts, where the technician, whose name was now Kalen, oversaw the retrofitting of salvaged ships into long-range scouts for the resistance. The settlement was known to the off-world cells as Winter's Heart, a place of myth and legend, a place where a single human and 12 widows had held off an Imperial cruiser and won. But to the 63 souls who now called it home, it was simply that, home. Dominic stood on the command deck of the main keep, a place that had once been his solitary living quarters. It was now a bustling operations center. He was no longer the grim recluse who had built a fortress to keep the world out. The lines on his face were deeper, but they were carved as much by laughter as by hardship. His eyes, once guarded, now held the quiet, steady confidence of a man who knew his purpose. He wore a dark blue tunic, woven from the tough fibers of a native plant with the silver insignia of their settlement, a stylized snowflake over a blooming flower, embroidered on the collar. A hand rested on the small of his back, a familiar, comforting weight. "The transport from the Cygnus blockade just broke orbit," Xylan said, her voice a low, pleasant hum in his ear. She stood beside him, her equal in all things. The fiery auburn of her hair was now streaked with a few strands of silver, earned in command and counsel. The defiant survivor had become a stateswoman, her words carrying the weight of a founder, her gaze holding the wisdom of a leader who had stared into the abyss and forged a new path. They have over 20 survivors, mostly families. "Good," Dominic said, placing his hand over hers. "Alara has the new residential block ready." Alara, the once timid youth with pale blue hair, was now their chief xenobotanist and head of civil administration, her gentle nature underpinned by a core of quiet steel. And Iris has her security teams on standby. Iris, the skeptic, was the settlement's warden, her tactical genius ensuring their home remained the safest place in the sector. Together, they went down to the main landing pad, a wide sheet of sintered ice and metal that steamed in the cold air. The other original sisters were there, their faces a portrait of calm competence as they directed the settlement's functions. They were no longer the 12, a single unit of grief. They were individuals, leaders, builders. The elder, Kira, now sat on the High Council, her voice the conscience of their community. The refugee transport, a battered but functional freighter, settled onto the pad with a sigh of weary engines. The main hatch hissed open, and a ramp extended. The new arrivals hesitated on the threshold, blinking in the thin sunlight. They were Kython, but a different kind from the ones who had first crashed here. They were families, males gaunt and weary from the blockade, children with wide, frightened eyes, and females who clutched their loved ones. their ears pinned back with uncertainty. They saw the settlement, the strange human male standing beside the legendary Xylan, the fusion of alien and human design, and they were afraid. An old Kythan male, his fur gray with age, stepped forward and bowed low. "Matriarch Xylan," he said, his voice trembling. We did not know what to expect. We were told there was a sanctuary here." Xylan stepped forward, her presence radiating a warmth untouched by the planet's cold. "There is more than sanctuary here," she said, her voice carrying across the landing pad. "There is a home, for anyone willing to help build it." A small Kythan girl, no more than 6 years old, with bright orange hair and ears that twitched with curiosity, peeked out from behind her mother's leg. She looked past the solemn adults, her gaze fixed on the glowing hydroponics dome and the children of the settlement, born on Boreas, a new generation who had never known war, who were running a training simulation nearby with Warden Iris. The girl's eyes went wide with a wonder that overshadowed her fear. Dominic knelt down, bringing himself to her level. He offered a slow, gentle smile. "It's all right," he said, his voice soft. "It's a little different here, but it's safe." The little girl looked from his strange, earless human face to the powerful but kind face of Xylan, then back out at the bustling, hopeful life of the settlement. She took a tentative step forward, her tiny hand reaching out, not for Xylan, but for him. He let her touch his rough, calloused fingers. "The winters are long," the girl whispered, repeating a fear she had likely heard 100 times on the journey. Dominic's smile widened. He looked up at Xylan, a lifetime of love and shared struggle passing between them in a single glance.